Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here with us. My name is Laura Horwood-Benton. I am the Public Programming and Community Relations Librarian at Portsmouth Public Library in New Hampshire. I use she, hers pronouns. I'm in my brightly lit fluorescent office with some art and plants behind me, and I'm a white woman with short brown wavy hair. I have on a very cozy yin-yang sweater. Some housekeeping. We have enabled subtitles for this event for greater accessibility. You can toggle these on and off at the bottom of your screen by clicking Hide Subtitle or Show Subtitle. You can also click View Full Transcript to see the whole transcript of the event. Please note that these are auto-generated, and so they may not be perfect. I'm going to begin this evening with our land acknowledgement that I think is especially important whenever we're talking about a topic that has to do with justice. The city of Portsmouth is on the homelands of the Abenaki people who have ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this area. According to tribal oral tradition, Abenaki people have lived in the place now called New Hampshire for more than 12,000 years, since before tribal memory. The Abenaki are part of a larger group of indigenous people who called themselves Wabanaki, or People of the Dawn, and form one of many communities connected by a common language family. Here at the Portsmouth Public Library, we are committed to acknowledging and honoring the human history tied to this land. If you'd like to know more about the history of the place that's now called Portsmouth, we do have more information on Indigenous resources on our website. So this event will last until 8:30 p.m. tonight. We plan to be respectful of your time. If you have questions about library services or upcoming programs, feel free to ask me at the end. We are recording tonight's event, and we will be sharing the recording on YouTube. Please note that everyone is muted at this time. There may be portions of tonight's event where you can unmute and contribute your thoughts or questions. You may also write that in the chat if you don't wish to be heard or seen in the recording, and I'll read out what folks say in the chat, so feel free to do that. We love hearing from you about what you'd like to see at the library, so I'll share an online event feedback form at the end in the chat. Fill it out and you'll not only help the library, you'll also be entered to win a library book bag. You do have to be local to pick it up. So we are really thrilled to welcome Emma Simpson-Tucker this evening. Emma has volunteered with the library for quite some time and presented on this topic to the library's task force on inclusion, diversity, and equity, which we call TIDE, which was fantastic. She gave us a lot to think about as we're always trying to improve our accessibility, the accessibility of the library space, and to be more inclusive in our collections, displays, book recommendations, and social media posts. On that note, Emma has helped us curate a Fat Liberation book list, which I will share in the chat. Feel free to put a hold on any titles that interest you if you have a Portsmouth Public Library card. And now I'm going to turn it over to Emma. So Emma, take it away. Oh, Emma, you are muted.
Thank you. Sorry. Hi. Thanks for having me. My name is Emma Simpson-Tucker, and I'm just going to share a little bit about myself before we get started and who am I to be giving this presentation. So I am a fat, cisgender, white lesbian. I think all of those things are really important to acknowledge when we're talking about any sort of marginalization, just because, as we know, marginalizations cross over. Yeah. And my pronouns are she, her. I work in reproductive and sexual health. And I've been fat most of my life. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is related to, or specifically personal experience, as well as community experience within the fat community. So I'm just going to get started. So as you can see on the pinned screen here. This is my screen sharing, so the screen is also mine, and then what you're seeing when I'm talking is, so there's two screens. And so I'm just gonna get started. So fat people are cool, combating anti-fat bias and celebrating body diversity. I thought that this was a fitting title. It was actually my working title, and then I kept it just because when I started sharing this with my friends and colleagues before I did it for the Portsmouth Public Library staff, everybody really liked it. And I think that it's also really important to like start off with like a positive statement about fat people. I think, yeah, it's just important. So this presentation, as Laura mentioned, was given first to the Portsmouth Library staff. And in that sphere, it really was more about like combating anti-fat bias. So fat liberation is definitely like a theme here. And I think a lot of the conversations are going to be focused on like anti-fat bias and how it shows up and how we can combat it. So yeah. So one of the first things that I want to say is that fat is not a bad word. And that is something that we just have to identify right off the bat, because clearly I'm going to be using the word fat a lot. And I do understand that a lot of folks, you know, have negative feelings that come up for them when they hear the word fat. And particularly if you are a larger bodied person or a fat person who has those feelings, like I'm here with you, I see you, I get it, and I respect those feelings. But truly, just at its core, like the word fat is a neutral descriptor. Sometimes it's wielded as a weapon, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. Something else that I wanted to bring up right away is that anti-fatness and white supremacy are inextricably linked. So anti-fatness really has its roots in white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Going back to the enslavement of African folks beginning in the 16th century, colonizers noticed that African folks tended to have larger bodies than white folks at that time, and thus fat bodies were no longer desirable due to colonizers' fear of being seen as similar to Black folks. And this was a shift that came after the Renaissance in Europe, when larger bodies were considered desirable, or at least less undesirable. There's more info about this in Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings, which is definitely on the Fat Liberation book list. And that's a really good read, so definitely recommend that. All right, and some basic definitions. So what is anti-fat bias? Anti-fat bias is the learned, socially and culturally reinforced bias against fat bodies or fat people, which can refer to individual attitudes as well as institutional and structural inequity. So this can be, you know, one person on the street saying something unprompted and unkind to you, harassing you, or it can also be inadequate access to medical care. So really wide spectrum here. Diet culture is a set of learned beliefs that places value on thinness and proximity to thinness over physical, emotional, and psychological well-being, and which classifies certain foods and food-related behaviors as good or bad. So really, diet culture is moralizing concepts like food and body size. The diet industry is a phrase that we're going to be hearing a little bit in this presentation, and I wanted to define that just because I think sometimes it's a little bit confusing what we mean when we say the diet industry. So the diet industry is the multi-billion-dollar industry that profits from folks' purchases of diet-focused products and services. So Weight Watchers, which has recently rebranded themselves as that sign with just the 2 W's, Noom, diet pills, anything like that. You know, you see sometimes advertised like those flat tummy teas or whatever. Those are all part of the diet industry. Basically, anytime you're like spending money trying to be thinner, specifically for the sake of being thinner, that's part of the diet industry. And then a little bit about clothing. So when we say plus size, this is used to refer to clothing that is labeled plus size, usually a size 16 or 18 and up in the US. This varies a little bit. Different brands are, you know, shifting a little. I'm specifically thinking about like Old Navy really has mostly like, basically all of their clothes are in the same place now, which is great for accessibility. And they're carrying up to, I think, a size 32 in the stores, all the stores. And then when we say straight size, This is used to refer to clothing that is not plus size. So usually a size 14, 16 US and down. There's some crossover to different brands have just like a different threshold for where their quote unquote plus size line starts. I know specifically with Target, their like straight size line goes up to an 18. And some places their straight size line only goes up to a 14. So really arbitrary too. But that's really what we're talking about. And then just a quick history of fat liberation and body positivity. So modern body positivity, the way that we hear about it today, would not exist without the fat acceptance movement that was created by fat, Black, and queer women in the 1960s. The National Association to Aid Fat Americans was a fat acceptance group founded in 1969, aiming to address weight stigma and discrimination against fat people in the United States. So this was specifically a US-based group. And then they were followed shortly afterward by an organization called the Fat Underground, which was a fat acceptance group created by radical feminists and lesbians in the 1970s. And their slogan is, "Doctors are the enemy, weight loss is genocide." Which I really personally like. We're going to talk a little bit about anti-fatness in medicine as well. And then one really important distinction to make, I think, when we're specifically talking about fat liberation is that body positivity and fat liberation have some crossover, but they're not the same thing. So fat liberation specifically aims to liberate fat bodies, obviously, from the confines of diet culture and anti-fatness, whereas body positivity as like a phrase has sort of turned into more of a buzzword, and folks who are actually fat are getting sort of left behind in that movement. And, you know, in some ways it's great because of course we should be centering bodies that are marginalized in other ways as well. So people who are trans or gender nonconforming, people who are, so sorry, everything just fell out of my head. People who are disabled, people of color, all of the folks who have bodies that are marginalized based on any number of factors should have access to, you know, liberation. But realistically, when we're seeing body positivity used as like a buzzword, it's really been overrun a little bit with people who have bodies that are not marginalized. So generally we're thinking about people who are thin, white, cisgender, so identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, able-bodied, and it's leaving the people behind who it originally aimed to benefit, and that's the problem. So where does anti-fatness show up? Really, pretty much everywhere, unfortunately. Once you see it, it's really hard to unsee. It's definitely one of those things where once you're sort of aware of it, you just see it everywhere you turn. And as somebody who is, you know, personally affected by anti-fatness, it truly is just exhausting. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So clothing access. I want to start here because this is one of the things that I think comes up so much, like just every day almost, you know, because we all have to wear clothes every day. So the fatness spectrum that you see here, the image, was coined by a person named Ash, who hosts the Fat Lip podcast. And this was born of like the fat liberation community. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this and go through the different categories because I think it's like a really useful tool for reference when we're talking about access to clothing for people who are fat. So small fat is a phrase that's used to refer to folks who can wear a 1X to a 2X, an 18 or lower in US sizing. Or if you're familiar with torrid sizing, that would be like a torrid 00 to a 1. And the reason that torrid sizing is specifically used as one of the parameters here is just that Torrid has been one of the most consistently available brands for people who are fat. It's one of the only really dedicated plus brands where fat people can shop in person. And by no means am I saying that Torrid should be, you know, immune to criticism. There have been actually a lot of weird things happening with Torrid lately for a lot of reasons. But in terms of access, they're really one of the only stores, along with, I think, like Lane Bryant that like have the actual sizes that will fit on fat bodies that you can just go to the store and buy something. So people in the small fat category can generally find clothes that fit at mainstream brands and can shop in many stores. The next category is mid fat. So that would be like a 2X to a 3X, a size US 20 to 24, or a size or torrid size 2 to 3. So these folks can shop at some mainstream brands, but mostly dedicated plus brands and online. Super fat would be a 4X to a 5X. That would be a US 26 to 32, a torrid size 4 to 6. And these folks generally wear the highest sizes at plus brands and can often only shop online. And then the last category is InfiniFat. So that would be a 6X and higher, a size US 34 or higher. And these folks can wear some torrid size 6, depending on the fit, the cut, the material that's used, the style, etc. For these folks, it's very difficult to find anything that fits even online, and they often require custom sizing. So this is just like based on what is physically available to people, right? But then you also factor in, I'm seeing Dress Barn. Yes, Dress Barn too. Yeah, definitely. I do find that I see less of those stores in person these days, but they definitely can still be a good resource. Yeah, so basically what I was saying is that as you go up in sizing, you're often forced to spend more money. And that, is a problem because the fatter you are doesn't mean you have more money, obviously. And it should really be equal. So that brings me to my next point, which is that I want to talk about the phrase fat tax. So that is a phrase that we use in the fat community to refer to the fact that plus size clothes are often way more expensive than their straight size counterparts or anything that would be like, similar in straight sizes. And so some people, have argued that this is fine, this is reasonable, because when you're creating larger sizes, you're using more material. But realistically, if you're thinking about, for example, one piece of clothing that is offered at a store from an extra, extra small to an extra, extra large, typically you're not going to expect that the extra, extra large is going to pay more money than the extra, extra small. And how they make that reality is that they just like sort of average out based on, the cost of materials and labor, put it all together and then divide it out, right, to make sure that people aren't having to pay more money for a larger size. So we could do that with plus sizes too, realistically. And we should. And then, of course, availability, like we just talked about, is it available in store or only online? There are obviously some issues that can arise when you are only able to shop online, just because, you can't try the clothes on. Sometimes you have to send them back. Sometimes that incurs an additional cost. Generally, you do have to pay shipping. So it's just, just not equitable. And then, of course, style and quality. So are the clothes stylish or aesthetically pleasing? Do you like the way they look? We deserve to have access to clothes that we like the way they look. Are they comfortable? Will they hold up to wear? All of these things are issues that come up when fat people are trying to buy clothes. And then I wanted to stop and talk about media. So, fat representation in media is not super plentiful. I feel like lately in the last probably like 5 or 10 years, we do have significantly more representation in the media. A lot of it is still pretty negative though. So when we're talking about like negative representation, character arcs that involve becoming thin as a major plot point of this character, particularly if someone's life is shown to be better or more fulfilling afterward because of the weight loss. Stereotypes of fat people. So, fat people, fat characters who only care about food, or their life is focused on their weight or losing weight. They are portrayed as unattractive or unappealing due to their weight, things like that. Or the character's weight is constantly the butt of the joke. So I see this a lot where like, there'll just be like constant digs about a character's weight that are just like, haha, funny. And then like they move on and it's really never addressed. So even if it's not like the focus of the plot line, it's still happening and it's still gross. And then I just feel like it's worth mentioning that The Biggest Loser TV show that abused fat people into losing weight and made Jillian Michaels super rich was like really popular and did really well. She's a little bit less relevant now. She's been, you know, trying to show up on social media lately and get some attention actually, but doesn't seem to be working, which I'm really glad about. But yeah, I mean, so that was on TV and people watched it and liked it and watched these fat people be, you know, abused and pushed to the point of physical illness for the sake of losing weight for other people to be entertained. So I think media is a really good place to stop and just sort of check in and see if anybody has like examples that have come to their minds, you know, right off the bat when we're thinking of media. And I'll actually share mine first. So the one that I always mention is if you have seen Friends, the Fat Monica plotline. So Monica just was like a fat person when she was younger, and there's like a whole plot line and constant flashbacks. There's even an episode where they're like, what if things were different? And like everybody has something in their life in the group that's like drastically different. And Monica's is that she never lost weight. And in this episode, she's shown to be like, you know, struggling to have a relationship and like dating this guy who is like really boring and unkind. So yeah, that's mine. I just want to know if anybody else has some that have really come to mind for them.
Hi, my name is Hannah, they, them pronouns. So immediately my 600-pound life comes to mind. I mean, so I do think that it is painted as sort of like a healthy lifestyle, but obviously it's still people who are put on display because of their very significant body weight, which, you know, in the show, it's obviously portrayed as unhealthy, which it could be, and that's sort of like, that's kind of neither here nor there of whether fat means unhealthy. It doesn't, but like, you see my point. But the fact that, you know, it is on display, I mean, I hope that, you know, everything that's happening in the show is, you know, with their consent, but it really is just for the entertainment of their body weight being shown to make other people feel better and to make other people feel like losing weight is the goal.
Definitely. I haven't actually watched any of my 600-pound life, but I have seen like a couple of like TikTok videos, and I just, the way that the people are portrayed just like strikes me as like they're just so unhappy. And you know, why do we need to show like fat people being unhappy? Like, you know, in a reality show.
And it's also on TLC, which is kind of famous for exploiting people that are in various marginalized bodies, various, you know, extreme situations. So there's also that as a factor.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the chat, someone has mentioned that there is quite a lot of fat phobia on Queer Eye, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I have some really significant issues with Queer Eye, and I really want to be able to enjoy the show because I think so much of it is like really just like lovely and heartwarming. But yeah, there's a lot of fat phobia on Queer Eye. I've actually like stopped a couple of the seasons like halfway through because there was an episode that I just couldn't deal with, and I like had the ick afterward. I think particularly from my perspective, I see that a lot from Jonathan Van Ness. And I'm just really disappointed that they continue to say things, not even just on the show, but like in real life too. I actually unfollowed them on social media just because they kept saying things that I was like, what are you doing? Yeah, it's really sad. It's disappointing.
I think we've come a long way in recent years, but there's that pretty pervasive trend of not only, as you say, the character's weight being the butt of the joke, but people constantly being maligned for being fat who are not actually fat, who in the categories that you mentioned of sizes would be absolutely in straight sizes, you know, and they're the one character on the show who's called fat consistently, and that's seen as a negative thing, and they're not even actually fat, which is pretty frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to just take a second to like talk about maybe some positive representation that we've seen too, because it does exist, and particularly recently it does exist. And one thing that comes to mind for me is Aidy Bryant's Shrill. Loved Shrill. And also I just watched Nicole Byer. If anyone is familiar with Nicole Byer, she's on the Fat Liberation book list. She has a stand-up routine that is on Netflix right now. It came out on my birthday. It was very exciting. And we watched it. I watched it with my wife, and it was really funny. It was really good. She is hilarious. She actually got her start on Girl Code on MTV, and she's doing real well now. So yeah, so anybody else like thinking of any like positive representation? Yes, Lambert. I see it popped up. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Guillermo from What We Do in the Shadows.
Yeah.
I was going to mention Dumplin' on Netflix, which I loved.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
The sister in Encanto.
I haven't seen that yet. I do need to watch that.
Yes, one of her older sisters. Whose superpower is super strength.
Nice.
Oh, Luisa? We have two contenders. I think it's Luisa. Yeah, Luisa.
Nice. Yeah. There's yeah. It does exist. I just wanted to acknowledge that too. Just that's all before we move on. I think that it can be really like amazing when there is a really wonderful piece of fat representation in media. Just feels really good to see ourselves represented, especially just doing regular like life stuff, you know? Yeah. Disney. Yeah, Disney did villainize fat characters a lot. Ursula. Yeah. Although that kind of backfired, didn't it? Because don't we love her though? But true. Absolutely true. All right, I'm gonna keep going. So medicine, this is a really big one. And I had a hard time sort of cutting down on this because as I mentioned before, I work in healthcare. And I have worked in the healthcare sphere for quite a long time. I recently started a job in reproductive and sexual health in July of 2021 at a facility where our provider is like incredibly fat positive. It's wonderful, really lovely environment for patients and staff in that way. So I'm just gonna sort of jump into it. So the concept of like health and wellness has changed a little bit. I feel like those again are like turning into like buzzwords. So we see all this stuff on social media, on TV or whatever about being well. We all just want to be well, but it's like often used as code for being thin or being thinner. And, you know, this also ties into the concept of like healthism, which is the concept that the more healthy you are, the more worthy you are, the more valuable you are. And this is used against fat people when people say you're fat, so you're unhealthy, which is not necessarily true, obviously, but it doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter. If someone's not healthy, whose business is it but theirs? Why are they less worthy of respect or love or like access to the world because they're not healthy? That it's so arbitrary too. And then also, of course, that ties into ableism. So, you know, anybody who has any kind of health issues or disability, fat or not, shouldn't be treated poorly because of those, you know, issues or disabilities. It just, I mean, I know I'm saying it with a tone that's like, what doesn't make sense? And, you know, truly, to me, it doesn't, but we all know like why it happens. It's just because, well, anti-fatness, eugenics, lots of stuff. And then, you know, using weight loss as a prescription for any and all ailments. This happens to fat people a lot when we're in the medical sphere. You know, we go to the doctor for an ear infection and they're like, have you considered losing weight? And it's like, well, that's just simply not the conversation that we're having right now. Can I please have like an antibiotic for my ear infection? And, you know, fat people are blamed for their health issues. Our health issues are blamed on our fatness, when often thin people are not held responsible for the same health issues. So I think particularly about the illness of diabetes and how, you know, people across the body size spectrum, you know, get and have diabetes, type 1 and type 2. But generally when we see a thin person with diabetes, they don't experience the like it's your fault that you have diabetes, right? But when we see a fat person get diagnosed with diabetes, people often are like, well, they ate too much sugar, which first of all, that's not how it works. If you think that, you actually have a really incorrect understanding of diabetes. But in general, it's like that kind of situation. And then, you know, medical mistreatment that actually leads to poorer quality of life. So we go to the doctor for an issue that they ignore because they want to focus on our weight. They won't treat us for the issue that they're ignoring. And that leads to us having poorer health, poorer quality of life. You know, incorrect or appropriate treatment being withheld, including and particularly trans care, such as gender affirming surgeries for people who are trans or gender diverse that want to pursue these surgeries. Often people are told that they have to lose weight first, and that's gatekeeping, and it's gross. And then pregnancy and childbirth are often gatekept from fat people as well. And there is a higher rate of intervention with fat people. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's because we have more problems when we're pregnant and birthing. I could talk about anti-fat bias in the pregnancy and childbirth community for a long time, just because I've done a lot of research about it, being fat and wanting to eventually be pregnant myself. And it's really scary. It's really daunting. Thinking about putting myself in that position as a fat person, really having to trust in the healthcare providers who are caring for you, and needing to, you know, believe that they're going to help you and care for you, and not pathologize your body because you're fat. And then, of course, I did have to do a whole slide on the BMI. It is nonsense. And I'm going to give you a little background too, because I think, you know, the BMI is nonsense gets thrown around so much. And I really want to like dive into like what the BMI actually like is. So the BMI was created by a Belgian guy named Quetelet, I think. I'm sorry, in the 1800s, who was not a physician and did not study medicine. So yes, he did not study medicine. He was not, he did not have like medical credentials at all. He also founded the study of phrenology, which was a super racist pseudoscience that was based on like studying the bumps on someone's head and determining their health or their like brain composition based on the bumps on their like head, like just feeling their head. It's very weird. And he was trying to identify what he called the average man, who he thought was the societal ideal. And who was the average man, you ask? Well, a cisgender white man, obviously, because that is what we are measuring everything against, I guess. And it just doesn't make sense because that is just such a small percentage of the overall population. And again, still not like medical information. And then in 1998, the National Institutes of Health in the United States changed their definitions for quote unquote overweight and obese. And a bunch of people were classified as overweight or obese overnight when their bodies didn't change. So really, how much trust can we put in that system when they just move the markers like kind of randomly? I also did want to touch on the fact that obese is considered a medical slur. Its function really is to pathologize fat bodies, which does lead to poor medical treatment, lack of compassion from care providers, and treatable illnesses that become serious due to lack of acknowledgement or treatment. So I do use the word obese a little bit in this presentation, only just to like reference situations where it's used, not to give it legitimacy, if that makes sense. I do consider it a slur against fat people. So, you know, why are we told that being fat will cause a whole bunch of health problems then? Why are people constantly talking about BMI? Well, firstly, we need to acknowledge that correlation does not equal causation. So just saying that fat people overall have poorer health outcomes doesn't mean it's because they're fat. It doesn't mean that it's because of their fatness. There are so many factors that are not accounted for when talking about folks' risk for developing certain illnesses. Recent studies also suggest that stress from marginalization is an enormous health factor. We do recognize that stress is not good for your health, and being marginalized is stressful. So, you know, if you're fat and you're in the medical sphere, and you're not being treated well by care providers, that's stressful. You know, receiving vitriol in your daily life just for being a fat person, that's stressful. And then, you know, you add on top of that, like other marginalizations, like if you're trans or gender diverse, if you're, you know, not straight, if you are a person of color, if you're disabled, you know, all add stress. And, you know, a lot of the time that's not accounted for when we're saying that X group of people has poorer health outcomes. And also remember that multi-billion-dollar diet industry we talked about before. They don't want to lose money. They don't want to lose money. And everyone, you know, institutionally in the United States is pretty much in on it. Like, you know, we're starting to question it, I think. Like, we're here we are at this program. But overall, people want to make money, and the diet industry makes money, and they don't want to lose money. And it's all connected, truly. And then this is like somewhat connected to like medical, like the medical sphere, but also other areas of life. So there's this thing that has become popular, which people in the fat community call health concern trolling. So when you're trolling someone, you're just sort of like pretending to say things to them that are genuine, and really you're just like harassing them. That's kind of the idea of that term. So this is when people will say things like, I'm just concerned for your health, and that's why I'm telling you that, insert phrase here. So that's why I'm telling you that no one's ever going to love you if you don't lose weight. That's why I'm telling you that your body is disgusting to me. That's why I'm telling you that you shouldn't be eating that. That's why I'm telling you that, you know, you got to exercise more, or like whatever judgment is being made. When someone says something like gross and unkind to a fat person about their fatness, and they say, I'm just concerned for your health, that's what we call health concern trolling. So yeah, we see this a lot online, but it can also happen in your personal or professional life. And I just wanted to stop here and see if anybody had any like experiences with this that they felt like they wanted to share, or yeah, anything like that. Just sort of check in and see if anybody has any, you know, contributions to this topic, or if you have any questions so far. This is a good time to stop too.
And feel free to write them in the chat, and we'll read them out from there.
It's okay if you don't do.
I have a question. I'll just jump in while we're leaving space. Do you have a good script that you've seen or used for a medical situation where the conversation, I liked what you said about like, that's not the conversation we're having right now. Is that something you know, think people could say to a medical provider, or what's a good script for like, you know, and the ideal is obviously see a different medical provider, but that's not always possible for folks.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely do. This is something that I've been working on really, really hard for a long time. And yeah. So one thing that you can say if you're a fat person in a medical situation, and someone's saying that they're not going to treat you, or they're trying to specifically talk about your weight and that's not what you're there to talk about, you can say to them, what would you recommend to a patient who was thin and having this issue? You can also say to your doctor, I would like you to please document that you are refusing me treatment for this issue. If your doctor is saying, well, lose weight and we'll see. That's happened to me. I've not personally had to say to a medical provider, like, you know, please document that. But that is advice that I have found in fat lib circles, and people really do have good experience with. Either the doctor will document it and you have that in your chart, or they'll be like, oh, I have to write down that I'm going to refuse you treatment. Well, I guess I'll just run the test. So sometimes it can, you know, just sort of.
Some folks are sharing in the chat things that have happened to them. So somebody with thin privilege having experience around that regarding a disability. So like, why don't you eat more salads? Why are you eating pizza when eating raw veggies actually would be detrimental to their health? And this person says could kill them. And then someone else shares that they've been told you need to stop being a prisoner to the house. You need to walk to prevent more bone and muscle deterioration. Just examples of people suddenly becoming experts in healthcare issues that they don't actually know very much about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's lots of that. Yeah, people suddenly becoming experts, like you said, in like healthcare issues that they just don't know anything about. It's just like, how do you think that you know about someone's body or their medical condition better than they do if you're, you know, not a medical provider? And even if you are a medical provider, you should be listening to your patients in a way that centers their experience living in their body. Because you might be the medical provider, but they live in that body every day. They know what it's doing. So they need your help through shared decision making to, you know, improve their health in whatever way they deem that they want to pursue. Yeah, that happens a lot. Well, thank you for all the input, everybody. The workplace. I do want to talk a little bit about like what it's like to be fat in the workplace. So fat people are statistically less likely to be hired or receive promotions or pay raises due to conscious or unconscious employer bias. There are studies about this for sure. And I actually have experienced this. You know, there's not like a way to say that this is what happened to me 100%, but pretty sure that happened. You know, health and wellness workplace initiatives that are weight-based, or even at all, just because like it's just not your employer's place to like tell you what you should be doing for your health. But particularly ones that are weight-based, it's like you're alienating your employees. And at my previous workplace, this did happen, and I did say something about it, and it was not met with, it was not taken well. Basically, I was told that I should think about how my criticism of a health and wellness initiative that alienated me in a professional environment made the people who organized it feel. And I was like, well, no, no. And, you know, there's no legal protection against workplace discrimination for fat folks anywhere in the United States except for the state of Michigan. Like, I don't know why specifically Michigan, but in 1976, the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act was passed in Michigan, and this included protections for fat folks in the workplace. So it's illegal to discriminate against people for being fat in the workplace in Michigan. So, and then of course there's just like the social expectation that everybody wants to have casual conversations about food and diet culture. And I feel like this happens so much in a lot of workplaces. Like, you know, people will say like, oh, I was so bad this weekend, I ate pizza or whatever. And it's like, well, please first don't assume that I want to talk to you about like how bad food is. I actually love food. And unless it was terrible, there's just no, you know, it's just very strange to me that people like legitimately think that we all just like think the same way about it. And of course, this can be really detrimental to people in all body sizes who have ever struggled with any kind of disordered eating. You know, you just shouldn't assume. And I think the reason that it comes up so much in like professional workplace environments is because those people don't often, right? I mean, not every time, but often the people that you work with are not your closest friends and confidants. They are not the people who know you really, really well. And so they think that this is something that you can talk about. Like, it's like, you know, talking about the weather. They're going to talk about food and diet culture with you. It can be really difficult to like go against the grain. Sometimes I did find myself at my last job, just kind of like nodding along, just kind of like staring off into the distance because it got so exhausting, sort of addressing it every time, even just to say like, hey, I don't want to talk about that. It's awful. Sex and romance. So often with representation of fat people in media in terms of sex and romance, or even in real life, just the way that we're perceived, we have this sort of dichotomy of fetishizing fat bodies, sort of removing their humanity and viewing them as sexual objects, or perceiving fat people to be sexless for no reason other than that they're fat. Happens a lot. We're seen as undesirable. People, who have strong attraction to fat folks, that sort of consider it like a fetish, are often like dehumanizing us in that sort of environment until we're like nothing but a category on, a pornography website. And that doesn't feel good. That's not true, like, personhood. That's not agency within sexuality and romantic relationships. It's objectification. Dating and dating apps. I personally am lucky to not really have bad experiences. I have not really used dating apps, but people that I've spoken with have had such a horrible time on dating apps. People of all genders that are fat that I've spoken with have had a really hard time on dating apps. So one thing that comes up is that people, and particularly this phenomenon I've heard the most from women, but people will post in their like dating app bio, like, I am fat. Like, they'll say the words, they'll say it very bluntly, like, I'm fat. They'll include multiple full body photos of themselves. And then, they still have experiences even after putting these sort of like safeguards into place to weed out the people who would just be so like, uninterested in them based on their fatness. They still have experiences where they like show up to a date and somebody's like, oh, well, I didn't realize you were so fat. And it's like, how? Like, what? And this situation for folks can be uncomfortable. It can be, dehumanizing. It can be miserable, but it can also be dangerous. Because you just never know like how somebody is going to treat you when they regard you in that way, when they're like, oh my God, you're so fat. When, like, you know what I mean? Like, when somebody is willing to say something like that to you, you don't know what else they're going to do. Also, one phenomenon that I wanted to talk about, particularly relevant to, dating apps, is that I've had gay friends who are men who are fat tell me that, on the apps like Tinder or Grindr or whatever, people will put in their bios, other gay men will put in their bios, no fats, no femmes. That's like a phrase that is like actually used. People like see it all the time. So ew. And, that also brings me to another point, which is that it's just weird that, often women who are people who identify within the gender binary, right? Because, it's not even super inclusive of like gender diversity, but for people who identify as women and are fat, often their fatness is like perceived or shown to be or regarded as like masculine in some way, even if they're not somebody who identifies as like masculine or isn't really masculine presenting, because you can be a woman and be masculine, obviously. And then, men who are fat are often like seen as like more feminine. It just doesn't make sense. It's just weird. It's like trying to like invalidate somebody's like gender identity based on their fatness. And I've seen it definitely from both sides. I've definitely experienced that as a fat person. And before I came out as a lesbian, it was like devastating. And now I'm just like, whatever. But, it can be really harmful. Yeah. And then, fatness and gender, I just wanted to talk about a little bit more in depth. So like we mentioned before, gender affirming care is often denied to fat, trans, and gender non-conforming folks, particularly when we're talking about like surgeries like top surgery or breast augmentation, or, any kind of bottom surgery. Fat trans folks are often told that they need to lose weight before they will have access to these surgeries. And that's terrible. And also there isn't really a good reason for that. You know, obviously I'm not a doctor, but you know, doing any research into this, basically they're just gatekeeping this care. And, you know, gender expression limitation and the binary of feminized and masculinized fatness, like we just talked about. I personally feel like I really felt like I had to overperform femininity, to be seen as like worthy, as a fat person. And I really held on to that for like a really long time. I just felt like if I wasn't feminine, like what was I? And I have since been lucky to have the space to unpack some of that. And especially as a lesbian, it's like fighting the patriarchy is, you know, almost natural when you're already going against the grain like that. But yeah, it really does limit folks by making them feel like they have to overperform gender to be seen as like worthy as a fat person. All right, this statement I feel like is really loaded, but all food, in terms of like the nutritional value of food, is morally neutral. There is no food in terms of nutritional value that is morally better or worse than another food. When we label foods as morally good or bad, that really is diet culture in effect. You know, it's really hard to get out of this way of thinking because it really is just everywhere you look. So here are some things that have really helped me in this sphere. So thinking about, how does the food taste? Do I love this food? Like, do I not like it? How is the texture? Do I enjoy the texture? How does it make my body feel? Right. So like one example that I was thinking about while I was sort of like putting this together is I have a soy intolerance. It's really annoying because soy is in everything and it makes me feel really sick sometimes. It's not an allergy though. It's definitely an intolerance. I never have had like an allergic reaction. So it's kind of one of those things where it's like I can like cheat, but I won't feel good. So sometimes I decide that a food is worth not feeling well. And there's no moral implication of that. I get to decide, right? Like I get to decide if eating this food that I really enjoy is worth feeling gross, is worth feeling as bad as I know I'm gonna feel. You know, you can decide for yourself what foods you want to eat. There's no moral implication there. And if food is morally neutral, so is the act of eating. No matter how much you eat, regardless of you know, amount, regardless of what foods you have eaten that day or yesterday, the act of eating is morally neutral. There are no moral implications to eating more or less or whatever. And everyone, regardless of body size, deserves to eat food that brings them joy and nourishes their body. I know that's not always the reality for everyone for any number of reasons, including, you know, health issues. But, you know, we deserve to eat food that we enjoy and or that makes us feel good, and we get to decide what that means. But there's no moral implication there. Accessibility and navigating physical spaces. What spaces are less accessible to fat people, and how do we identify how we can make our spaces more size inclusive? So one thing that I think of right off the bat are airplanes. Airplanes are a nightmare for fat people. Oh my God, it is so nerve-wracking. And personally, I've never had a poor experience, but I've heard so many horror stories of fat people getting kicked off of planes because somebody complained that they had to sit next to a fat person. I am really privileged in that I have a thin partner, and my wife is, you know, generally with me if we're like traveling on an airplane. So, you know, we sit next to each other and nobody bothers me, but I really do feel like that's because I am in proximity to my thin wife. And, you know, arms with arms with chairs, chairs with arms that are too narrow in spaces like a waiting room or a restaurant, a restaurant that only has booths, particularly if you've ever sat in like a booth at a restaurant where the table is like bolted to the floor, that's a problem for fat people a lot of the time. Sometimes we just can't fit in that like space. And it's really important to think about that when you're, making plans with your fat friends. If you're, in charge of like furnishing a space that is a public space. I know the library got really awesome like chairs last year even, that are like, I think they're either very wide or they're armless. And that was great. I think that's great. Yeah. And so what do we do about all this stuff? So we're talking about all of these things that are happening in the world, and, the limited access that fat people have to different things. What do we do about it? So really interrupt anti-fatness and start with yourself. And if you are somebody who's not fat, I'm particularly talking to you. So the way you feel about your own body, when you perceive it to be quote unquote too fat or too big, whether or not you're fat, can and does translate to your attitude toward fat people. I think that is something that's really important to say and really important for people who are not fat to acknowledge, really for all of us as well, just in general, because when you look in the mirror and you're like, I don't like myself. I don't like my body. I don't like whatever, because I think that I'm too big or I'm too fat. That is going to subconsciously translate in your attitude towards other people who are fat. It's like when someone says to you like, oh, I feel so fat. And it's like, I'm sitting there like, okay. Yeah. And, challenging these thoughts and feelings when they come up as much as you can, that can even just mean like sitting with a feeling and saying, okay, where is this coming from? Am I feeling this way because of my anti-fat bias? Because we all have anti-fat bias to some degree. We live in a world that is anti-fat and that is learned. But really like thinking about it is a good step. And also to address anti-fat sentiments when you hear them. Just, you hear somebody say something, even if it's not to or about a fat person that's really anti-fat, just be like, hey, that seems pretty anti-fat or pretty fat phobic. Interrupting those conversations can be really important because it also then sort of prompts other people to think about where that's coming from. And so advocating for yourself as a fat person. So Laura actually asked about one of these things that I'm about to talk about. So, advocating for yourself in a medical environment. If you're a fat person and you're at a medical appointment, you can decline to be weighed. You can ask a provider to document their refusal to test or treat you based on your weight. You can inquire as to whether a provider would recommend the same treatment for you in a fat body as for a thin person with the same symptoms, or say, what would you recommend for somebody who is thin and having this issue? Setting healthy boundaries in personal and professional spaces. You can say things like, I'm not interested in talking about dieting or weight loss. How was your weekend? How was your family? Have you read any good books lately? It sounds kind of cliche and silly, but I've had really good success with that, particularly at work when you maybe just really don't want to hear it. But it's not somebody that you want to have like an in-depth conversation about it with. Just saying like, I'm not interested in talking about dieting or weight loss. Let's talk about this other thing instead. Which has been really successful for me. So I hope it would be successful for other people. And asking about or researching accessibility ahead of time. So if you're concerned about the access to a space that you might have, maybe just like looking it up, or, how wide are those theater seats? Are there accommodations available if those seats turn out to be too small? Does that restaurant that you're planning to go to have accessible seating, chairs without arms, or, booths where the table does move a little bit, so you don't have to worry about not being able to like move it around. You know, I'm particularly thinking about the Repertory Theater in Portsmouth. I love the Rep, and before the COVID spike, I went to see Peter Pan for my birthday, and it was great. And I've been a couple of times in the last couple of years, so I like knew what I was getting into. But for reference, I wear like a size US 24 on the bottom, and those seats are like a squeeze for me. Like, you know, I can do it, but it's not super comfortable. Like, I'm not in pain the whole time. It's not comfortable though. And every time I go, because I do still go because it's, you know, local and I enjoy it, and financially it's accessible to me. It's not like super, you know, it's not like $100 a ticket or anything. But every time I go, I'm like mad about it all over again. And the last time we were there, I like made a comment. I was like all annoyed. And my wife was like, well, honey, like, you knew though, right? And I was like, well, I did know, but I'm still mad. Like, I'm here because I want to be here. I wanted to come see the show. It was worth it to me, but I still have feelings about the fact that the seating is not comfortable for me because it's too small. Like, that sucks. And having to confront those feelings at a time when you're trying to enjoy yourself is also really challenging, I think. Something else is that you can do is just to listen to fat people. If you are somebody who's not fat, and if you are somebody who's fat, consume our art. You know, do you use social media? Go follow some fat people. That has done wonders for me as a fat person, just like normalizing for me in my little noggin, the existence of fat people that aren't just me, or fat people I know in real life. Do you read books? Go find some fat authors. We have that book list we keep mentioning. So definitely take a look if you're a reader. Do you watch movies or TV? Do a Google search and watch a couple things with fat characters who were allowed to be fat without like a redemptive weight loss arc. And I'm going to list some people who I particularly really love that you can access on social media. Roxane Gay, she is a writer. She is so cool. She wrote Hunger, Difficult Women, and Bad Feminist. Bad Feminist is like one of my absolute favorites. She's also an incredible croissant baker. Her Instagram is really fun. And yeah, and Roxane is really interesting because yeah, she just has like so many different things that she's good at that she does professionally and personally. And yeah, I would recommend following Roxane Gay and reading some of her stuff. She also has a really good TED Talk. Carissa Enneking is, she started out as like a social media influencer, I guess. She's the founder of Fat Girl Flow, which is a blog for happy fatties. That's what she says. She is just like a fat liberation internet presence, and her like influencer type status has sort of shifted. And now she just kind of like has this following, and she's just like kind of like being fat and doing stuff. Less influencing, I think. Like, there's not a lot of like product stuff going on with Carissa's social media at this point. She also has a fat partner, Jay. And so they post a lot, both of them separately and together, post a lot about just like navigating the world together as two fat people who are in love. It's really great. The challenges and the positives. Meg Boggs, the author of Fitness for Everybody. She's an athlete, like a power lifter. She's a mother. That's part of, you know, what she posts about. And she is a fat pregnancy and birth advocate recently. She went through a cycle of IVF. She is open about her PCOS diagnosis. And actually today, literally just before I started this program, I saw her Instagram video where she shared that her IVF transfer was successful and she's pregnant. So she's really generous with what she's like sharing online about like the process of going through IVF as a fat person. And she's just so cool. Stephanie Yaboa is the author of Fattily Ever After, and she's a content creator and blogger and a freelance journalist. So she like writes stuff all over the place, and I often see stuff popping up from Stephanie Yaboa. So if you give her name a Google, like a bunch of different articles will come up all over the place. She's really awesome as well. Virgie Tovar wrote You Have the Right to Remain Fat, which is a book that I really love. It's pretty short, pretty quick read. Really like positive and uplifting while still like really addressing, you know, really significant issues. She's also the host of the Rebel Eaters Club podcast, and just like generally a fat activist on social media and in her author life. Aubrey Gordon is the creator of Your Fat Friend and the author of What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, which is a book that is also really great. She recently, within the last like 6 to 8 months, I think, I feel like everything is so like warped in my brain time-wise just because of COVID, but pretty recently she like revealed her identity. She was writing anonymously for a really long time. And she also is a host of the podcast Maintenance Phase, which is like so good, so funny, so, you know, centers on fat issues. And yeah, she's great too. There's a lot of great people. And Imani Barbarin is one of my absolute favorite people to follow on social media. She is the creator of the Crutches and Spice blog. She is a disability blogger, a model, an actress, a public speaker, a communications director. She's on TikTok, she's on Instagram, she's on Twitter, she's everywhere. I love her so much. She is so just incredible and so generous with what she's willing to share. And she also talks a lot about how her Blackness intersects with all of these other, you know, things that she's dealing with. Just really wonderful. All right, and to end, just gonna talk a little bit about just like some things that we hear a lot. So things you should not say to fat people. You're not fat, you're beautiful. Don't say this. It implies that the two are mutually exclusive. It denies our lived reality and tells us that we're ugly or unattractive or unappealing based only on our body size. I feel so like, there's such a cognitive dissonance for me when I say something casually about like I'm fat, right? So really what I'm saying here is like if somebody's casually using the word fat, because I think somebody who is fat, who is using the word fat for themselves in a negative way, that kind of requires a different vibe, right? Like you're not just going to be like, yes, because maybe they're not there yet. And that's okay too. But for somebody who's just using this word very neutrally, and they're like, you're not fat, you're beautiful. It's like, I don't know about you, but I can see me, and I know me, and I am fat. It's just like it feels really weird. It's like almost like where do we go from there? Because if I get like angry and I'm like, no, I am fat. They're like, no, and it's like, I am though. Like it's so confusing. The important thing is that you're healthy. Again, that's healthism. Health should not be a prerequisite for respect or worth. And this goes back to that concept of healthism, which also ties into ableism. And I am going to use the O word again. So when people say, well, it's not like you're obese. So again, the BMI is a racist and useless measurement of health. And those of us who are classified as obese under this poorly constructed system are just as valuable and deserving of respect as anyone else. Also, obese is a slur. Also, it's so arbitrary too, because it's really hard to have conversations with people when they say things like this. When the reality, like if somebody said to me, well, at least it's not like you're obese, I just want to kind of say like, yeah, I am. Like if you're looking at like the actual like classifications of the BMI, yeah, I am classified as obese. And if that doesn't make sense to you, it's because it doesn't, the whole system of like pathologizing bodies based on their fatness just doesn't make sense. That's why you're confused. That's why you feel like I'm the exception. It's because it doesn't make sense. There's no exception to be made. The whole thing is trash, throw it away. And particularly this last one, if you are not fat, I would say, please, please, please do not say, I feel so fat, specifically to a fat person, but even in general, because fat is not a feeling. I would encourage you, not to say this at all. And, particularly when you're saying this to fat people, it's like you want us to reassure you that you don't look like us. And that's really weird. That's like a really weird, yucky thing to do to somebody, to make us feel like you want us to reassure you that you don't look like us, because that would be bad. Don't do that. And then just to sort of like show the other side of the coin here, things you should say to fat people or alternatives for some of the things that I showed in the last slide. If somebody says, I'm fat, and they're saying it, maybe in a more derogatory way, you could say, and you're smart, funny, you're nice to be around, and you're beautiful, or whatever. It's not either or. I think that's the thing we get tripped up on, right? It's like our fatness doesn't cancel out any of the other things that are good about us because it's not inherently bad. And if you're planning to go somewhere with one of your friends who's fat, will this place we're going be accessible for you? Let's find out together. And I would reserve this typically for folks who have talked to you about the ways they experience anti-fatness in physical spaces. But this can make all the difference. Or you can just take steps to suggest activities that will be inclusive. If you have a friend who, is fat, don't invite them to a theme park. Theme parks, I think, typically give fat people a lot of anxiety. We never know what rides are going to be accessible to us if we're somebody who likes to go on rides. If you're going to a new restaurant together, you can, look at the restaurant's website, or even call the restaurant and be like, what's your seating like? If you're concerned that this could be an issue for your fat friend, that they might not be able to enjoy themselves, call and ask. And as an alternative for saying, I feel so fat, if what you really mean is that you're not feeling good about your body, you just say that. You can just say, I am not feeling good about my body today. I am having a bad body day. That is okay. And that is so understandable, regardless of your body size. Like, we live under the rule of diet culture, which aims to make us all feel like we should be making our bodies smaller all the time at any cost to be worthy. So I understand that this concept affects more than just people who are fat, but it is the most harmful to people who are fat. And so naming that feeling as like, I'm not feeling good about my body today, and sort of like unpacking for yourself what that means, and not blaming your body for its size when you're expressing negative feelings about your body, changes this narrative for you and for the people around you. And then something that you should definitely say to fat people is, you are very cool, because we are, and we deserve to hear it. Yeah, that is the end here. So I know we've been recording, and Laura wanted to make sure that there was time at the end for people to ask questions and not be recorded. So I'm just gonna say that I'm done with my content, and we can sort of go from there.
Thank you so much, Emma. So I think what I will do is stop the recording now, and then we can have a little bit more discussion if people are interested or have questions. So to close it, I'll just say thank you so much. That was really fantastic.